thought I had already buried the past, but the past doesn't rest. It watches. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't come alone. My name is Helen Moore. I am 70 years old, a retired librarian in a small town in rural Georgia, where people expect their world to run on predictable pages and comforting resolutions. My life was precisely that: quiet, ordered, and absolutely defined by my marriage to Robert Bob Moore. To the outside world, Bob was a quiet man, the proud, solemn-eyed Vietnam vet who kept to himself, worked a steady government job, and tended our immaculate garden. He was my rock, my peace, and the living guardian of an old sorrow I dared not disturb. Bob died 6 weeks ago. His heart simply stopped. No fanfare, no illness, just a definitive, cruel silence that ripped the final, most essential chapter out of my book. Now I am swimming in the silent emptiness of the life he left behind, which, like the man himself, proved to be far more complex than I ever imagined. I thought I was prepared for everything except the loss itself, but the reality that descended upon us during the final reading of his last will and testament shattered my tidy life entirely. Bob left behind not a complex trust fund, but a legacy of zero. His entire estate, the modest house, the savings, the single vintage truck he loved, was listed simply: all physical and financial assets divided equally between myself and our 2 grown children, David and Sarah. My son David, 45, is a high-powered, cynical real estate investor in Atlanta, a man whose love is often measured in yield percentages. My daughter Sarah, 40, is a meticulous and intensely competitive lawyer who lives a perfectly manicured, perpetually scheduled life in coastal Carolina. Neither one had the emotional capacity to understand a small, quiet life. They came for the final accounting not to mourn, but to calculate. The initial shock of their total disappointment was audible. The meager savings account wasn't the 7 figures they assumed. It was only enough to cover the funeral and the coming year's property tax. But the final shockwave was centered on one singular non-liquid asset specifically named in the will, which I was bequeathed solely and directly: the original combat log of Lieutenant Robert G. Moore for Helen, to keep the memory. Mr. Evans, the old family attorney, looked visibly embarrassed. He presented the asset: a large, cumbersome, aged leather journal, its cover scuffed, its binding soft and yielding. It smelled distinctly of old canvas, earth, and forgotten metal. It was heavy, far heavier than paper should be. I cradled it against my chest, the final, most intimate connection to the haunted life he led and rarely discussed. The children erupted in a unified storm of confusion and sharp entitlement. "A journal? That's it?" David sneered, adjusting his bespoke blazer, the very color of high disdain. "My father was connected, Mrs. Evans. 30 years in Department of Defense adjacent sectors. He managed federal funds. People don't live a quiet life like that unless they're hiding a war chest. A journal is not an inheritance. It's an insult." Sarah's response was colder, delivered with the legal precision of a professional closing statement. "We need to address the intangibles, Mom. Dad had specific resources in Vietnam. There was always a story about a mission, some unofficial military funding that vanished after a hostile raid in '75. That journal doesn't contain poetry. It contains the map. We both know the scuttlebutt. He didn't die broke. He died secretive." They dismissed my profound, final connection to my husband's sorrowful soul as a mere vault key. Their eyes weren't looking at a treasured personal memoir. They were looking at an encryption manual to a mythical load of military-grade gold bullion that vanished decades ago. A family rumor passed down that became absolute reality in their greedy, entitled minds. They had convinced themselves, and now me, that this simple log was a life-altering vault for an unforgivable fortune. The confrontation in the sterile law office shattered the peace I craved. David made a clumsy attempt to borrow the journal for forensic analysis, grabbing it until my sudden fierce strength startled him back. Sarah, realizing force wouldn't work, immediately changed tactics. She deployed the emotional manipulation toolkit of the absent daughter, smothering me with phone calls, asking about my health, feigning interest in my retirement, all while dropping thinly veiled suggestions about authenticating the value of the heirloom. They needed the secret, and I was suddenly its only barrier. Back home, surrounded by Bob's suffocating silence and the heavy, accusing furniture, I finally sat down with the journal. I wanted comfort. I wanted his words, his poetry, his final explanation for the quiet sorrow he carried every day. But what I found on the brittle, yellowish pages was far from comforting. It was worse than an empty page. The journal was filled, dense, compact, meticulously written from cover to cover, but not in English. It was a precise, tight flow of seemingly random numbers, specialized acronyms, phonetic letters, and unusual mathematical symbols organized in grid formats. It wasn't simple code. It was a multi-layered, organized, coded language. A disciplined cipher executed with the skill of a man who wrote it as naturally as breathing. It was entirely unreadable to a librarian, to a child, and likely to a common cryptographer. The code, Bob's final guarded statement, was a final barrier to the simple truth I sought. The profound sense of betrayal struck me hard. After everything, Bob still carried the secrets, choosing a language I couldn't understand for his final word. His entire quiet life with me felt like a secondary act, overshadowed by the unreadable drama of those cryptic pages. My loneliness was absolute. I, the simple keeper of knowledge, was now trapped between my profound need for truth and the aggressive financial entitlement of my own children, whose suspicion had, ironically, been confirmed. The journal wasn't a poem. It was indeed a safe. My immediate and paralyzing concern became the children's absolute certainty of the military gold. If the log did, in fact, reveal illicit funds, the ensuing storm, the federal investigations, the property seizures, the final ruination of the man I loved would consume my last peaceful years. I knew David and Sarah would risk everything to seize the fictional millions. My peace depended entirely on ensuring the ledger of zero remained exactly that, empty. The search for the code became my immediate, solitary assignment. My expertise as a retired research librarian became my greatest asset. I dove into military history archives, classified document theory, Cold War cryptography manuals, and personal recollections from the Vietnam era, operating under the safe disguise of genealogy research. I pored over microfiches, scanned online databases, and analyzed known intelligence ciphers used between 65 and 75. Nothing matched. Bob's code was personal, specific, and intensely insulated. Days turned into suffocating weeks. The cipher resisted every attack. The phone calls from David and Sarah escalated from polite inquiries to blatant probes about my access to safe deposit boxes. Their demands were growing shrill, focused, and utterly overwhelming. The simple fact that the heavy log smelled distinctly of metal fueled their fire, proof positive to their avaricious minds that it had indeed been buried near a metal stash. I retreated further, locking myself into Bob's small, seldom used home office, the one room where he guarded his most personal silence. Surrounded by his old tools, his military photos, the faces I never learned, and the single radio he used for shortwave, static-laden calls I never understood, I searched for the linguistic key. That's when I found the first small flaw in the discipline. Bob was an obsessively precise man. His toolkit, labeled, organized, perfectly aligned, contained a single object that seemed deliberately, sloppily out of place. An old, worn paperback novel by the chair, titled The Lonely Road Home. The book itself was common, unremarkable. But a closer inspection revealed what my meticulous eye should have caught earlier. On page 33, next to a printed passage describing a winding back road, Bob had faintly underlined 7 specific words in sequential order. The simplicity of the oversight, a common keyword substitution cipher using common popular fiction, was jarring. Bob, the disciplined military mind, using something so obvious and domestic was baffling. But the real immediate truth hit me with devastating clarity. The book wasn't out of place. It was out of the time. The copyright was from 1990. The journal code was from 1973. The deciphering key could not have been created nearly 2 decades later. This simple book was not the cipher key, but a desperate trail marker, deliberately placed for me, the researcher, the meticulous organizer, to find now. It was his last quiet plea for help, decades later. The journal was filled with the silent evidence of his entire adult life being built on an impenetrable linguistic lock. But the final message, left at his death, was a breadcrumb trail I had to follow because my time for investigation was almost gone. David and Sarah's pressure was reaching a fever pitch. Their lawyers had now sent a formal letter to Mr. Evans demanding immediate inspection and third-party appraisal of all high-value items within the deceased property, with special emphasis on the combat log and any metal containers. The time for simple research had passed. I was now locked in an investigation where the simple search for gold was about to expose a darkness that went beyond my 2 greedy children. I clutched the heavy, smelling journal, recognizing the truth. The book led to the only man Bob trusted to speak the same language, a veteran, a living face from those haunted photos I never understood. I had to find a ghost from his past to expose the ghost that ran his life. The lonely librarian, consumed by the simple quest for an honest memory, was about to follow a cipher that would break open a massive conspiracy and prove that some secrets are indeed more valuable than any inheritance. The underlying passage in Bob's old novel, The Lonely Road Home, was a clear message from the dead, a specific location and time described in the text, carefully selected. It was the designated rendezvous point from his past, not the key to the cipher itself. He had left a flair that only his dedicated librarian wife would find, an instruction manual for the last mile of his defense. My anxiety over David and Sarah's escalation became palpable. They were no longer inquiring, they were attacking. Sarah's legal letters became precise, targeting the undue secrecy surrounding Bob's private office. David was now calling my few close friends, painting me as a delusional widow clinging to sentimental items, actively establishing the legal groundwork for an emergency psychiatric assessment that would remove me and the journal from the home. I was in a race against a clock powered by my own children's ruthless ambition. I knew if they succeeded, the diary would be ripped apart by greed, and Bob's final, honest voice would be silenced forever. I packed my minimal belongings and the heavily scented, metal-smelling journal, placing them into Bob's single vintage trunk, using a disguise of grief travel to cover my tracks. The meeting spot dictated by the underlined text was a small, desolate town in the Carolina Lowcountry, hundreds of miles from Georgia, a region saturated with forgotten veterans and long-standing political influence. My new goal was simple: find the one ghost from Bob's past who knew the code. My trip was lonely, haunted only by the fear that I was chasing a dead end set up by a grieving, confused man decades after his supposed action. On arrival in the dusty, quiet town, the single building that matched Bob's marked text was an antique shortwave radio shop tucked behind a post office, a perfect place for secrets and communication without paper. The owner was an old man named Frank, frail, deeply wrinkled, but possessing the unmistakable gaze of a man who has seen 1,000 battlegrounds. The very first question I asked, a code I lifted from an acronym in Bob's radio maintenance files, a completely unrelated file that suddenly made sense, unlocked Frank's guarded facade immediately. Are the 75 Charlie antenna still capable of receiving the primary band data, Frank? I asked, my voice thin, a sound of desperation I hadn't made since Bob's death. Frank didn't look up from his work. His quiet, immediate answer carried the weight of a past shared with Bob. Only when they're cleaned of old dirt, ma'am. That old dust keeps the honest signal quiet. I had found the connection. He ushered me into a cramped back room, a dark sanctuary smelling of static and history. There, Frank's true reality was exposed. The back wall was entirely covered by an immense map of North Vietnam and Laos, meticulously labeled with red grease pencil circles, all focused on a singular region marked Project Blue Wing. Bob wasn't selling old equipment. He was maintaining the legacy of an immense military operation. I carefully presented Bob's ciphered journal. Frank's reaction was slow, methodical, utterly without surprise. He kept it. Good. He sighed, the final weight of Bob's secret now settling on his old shoulders. Frank confessed the log was not about gold bullion. It was the Tactical Intelligence Journal of Project Blue Wing, a deep, covert, unsanctioned military intelligence operation they both ran during the final chaos of the 1970s collapse. It wasn't about theft. It was unlawful and unmonitored intelligence asset acquisition. Their mission, initiated off books, recovering compromised American assets before they could fall into enemy hands. The illegitimate gold was merely the family story used as a cover for their long, cold silence. But the central truth of the journal was terrifyingly current. It wasn't just intelligence data. The code within was the key to identifying 5 individuals, 5 high-ranking double agents Bob and Frank had covertly re-recruited for U.S. asset acquisition, 5 individuals whose public careers were absolutely pristine, all working at the highest levels of American finance and government. The cipher contained active operational names and current classified financial trail tracking, details so sensitive they could dismantle the U.S. shadow state if exposed. And the man whose original identity code, Eagle Zero, dominated the final 2 decades of the log's coded entries, wasn't Frank. It was a man named Senator Sterling, an extremely influential political power broker in D.C. and an old command structure for the defunct Project Blue Wing. Sterling's clean reputation and massive power, his entire career, rested on the absolute certainty that this journal was dead, forgotten, and never to be deciphered.
Frank finally handed me the decoder. It wasn't based on military strategy, but on an intimate musical language shared by the small, trusted inner circle. The log was an exact numeric substitution cipher based on the sequential numbering of the verses and lines of a collection of 1970s country gospel songs that Bob always played on his shortwave radio, the static-laden transmissions I used to hear but never understood. A language built not of spies, but of solace. The music, dismissed as his quiet retreat, was his final fortress of defense. Frank was distraught, realizing the journal's true meaning was not just historic, it was a current and mortal threat. He knew Bob left the code just for me, his one chance to find the truth if the family went to the wrong side for answers. Bob knew they'd never look at the hymnal, ma'am, Frank whispered, tears in his aged eyes. He left this for your own security. Senator Sterling must not find this. He has everything to lose, and he won't stop at just burying paper. I looked down at the coded entries on the aged vellum, now clearly recognizing the coded phrases. 0. Senator asset transfer completed 99, and Eagle, primary asset failure contingency applied Washington 02. This was no fantasy gold. This was the proof of an immense illegal espionage web that reached right to the top of the U.S. government. The urgency intensified with terrifying speed. Frank warned me about Bob's shortwave radio at home. He suspected it was not just a hobby, but Bob's constant, decades-long monitoring device. I had to get back to Georgia. I had to face my children who, unbeknownst to them, were demanding the physical record of a threat that would instantly annihilate them if exposed. The imaginary threat of the military gold was suddenly insignificant next to the true political danger the diary represented. The paranoia escalated as I drove back to Georgia, the journal now my heaviest, most lethal possession. My children's simple greed had unintentionally created the opening for the senator, who undoubtedly employed his own sophisticated asset recovery agents. Frank had confirmed the absolute need for the journal to be protected. It was his life insurance and his last connection to a life he truly believed was honest. As I pulled back into my peaceful, tree-lined street in Georgia, the scene outside my house shattered my control. Sarah's BMW was parked diagonally on my lawn, and a large, expensive SUV with blacked-out windows I didn't recognize. They hadn't waited. The pressure wasn't coming from greed now. David and Sarah were in my home, violating my silence, likely tearing the house apart searching for the imaginary safe, inadvertently giving Senator Sterling's network all the signal they needed to find the real secret. The gold digger hunt was now acting as a cover for the political agent hunt. My safety had just been reduced to 0. I parked 3 streets away. The moment to simply mourn Bob was over. I was officially activated in my final role, the silent custodian of a criminal state secret. The peaceful librarian had to turn into the most ferocious enemy of her own children to protect her own existence and Bob's truth. I had to go inside, armed only with the country gospel cipher, the fear of an approaching assassin, and the absolute certainty that my children, in their petty desperation for money, were about to become casualties of a massive cover-up. The weight of Bob's life fell on me in one terrifying, beautiful act of terminal loyalty. The fear that held me still outside my own house was replaced by an immense, clarifying fury. My children, David and Sarah, had shattered the only peace Bob had ever built, not for genuine inquiry, but for pure, predatory avarice.
Their aggressive attempt to claim my legal competence via a psychiatric review, the wellness clause, was the final unforgivable transgression. I realized their hunt for the legendary millions was now a severe personal threat against my last shred of freedom. The sight of the unmarked black SUV sitting quietly behind Sarah's pretentious car confirmed the worst. The gold digger's noisy quest had successfully alerted the wolves of the political underground. They had opened the door for professionals who wouldn't just tear up the floorboards, but would eliminate the root problem, me, with absolute finality. I executed my plan with the efficiency of a lifelong librarian organizing a massive collection. I bypassed the front, locked all access points, and moved swiftly carrying the heavy, metallic-smelling journal toward the silent, damp cold of Bob's cellar, the only space my fastidious children would ever genuinely fear entering. Upstairs, the loud sounds of David and Sarah's frantic search in the kitchen filled the floor above me, the noise of their entitlement destroying Bob's meticulously organized life. I needed time. I needed chaos. I picked up the house phone and, keeping my voice panicked and shrill for effect, broadcasted my false discovery loudly. My son's partner. Thank God. David and Sarah are here. They're crazy. But look, I remember Bob talking about the gold. It's buried under the kitchen floor, right at the corner with the old yellow linoleum. They're tearing everything up to find it. They're tearing up the floor, finding everything to find what's beneath the linoleum. The gold is there. Send help, please. I slammed the phone down. The signal was clean. The theatrical chaos had two guaranteed results. First, David and Sarah were given a tangible, immediate target to waste hours on, diverting their frantic search from the true log. Second, and critically, the senator's agents now had a designated, localized spot, the kitchen floor, to focus their monitoring efforts, while the actual decoding took place in the silent cold of the cellar. The kitchen had become the decoy, a noise chamber broadcasting financial fantasy. Down in the damp air of the basement, I sat on an old, heavy wooden stool. The country gospel hymnal, the code key, opened a window into a part of Bob I'd only ever suspected. The methodical transfer of symbols into coherent English, aided by my meticulous cross-referencing from years of research, was devastating. The secrets were complex, dark, and utterly now. I translated two threads simultaneously. One was a chilling log of past actions, confirming my greatest fear. Bob's so-called government consulting job was an active intelligence system management ISM operation, not espionage against foreign powers, but an active, sustained surveillance system put in place by Senator Sterling to eliminate all domestic opposition during his climb to power decades ago. Bob and Frank didn't secure U.S. assets, they hunted U.S. dissent. He hadn't just carried a political secret, he had been the quiet administrator of a high-level treason. My peaceful husband had spent the last 2 decades running silent, secret domestic security for a corrupt political figure. My profound love for him was tainted with a sickness I hadn't prepared for. The second, more urgent threat of the cipher wasn't historical at all. It was an inventory of what they called Project Aegis assets. The coded data explicitly documented a crucial recent document, an official bank affidavit connecting Senator Sterling's personal offshore financial entity to a notorious political organization recently implicated in a national money laundering scheme. Bob had the goods, the final irrefutable link to destroy the senator's financial fortress and legacy. He kept his own secret safe by maintaining continuous surveillance over the single most powerful figure who had both benefited from and been threatened by his decades of silence. But the fear that these powerful enemies were listening and closing in gave way to the most beautiful, unpredicted betrayal of the log, the twist of love. Tucked not into the complex cipher, but under a thinly glued inner lining of the log's cover, a technique visible only to the obsessive eye of a lifelong librarian, was a fragile, folded, personalized note from Bob. The note was a quiet, direct confession. He admitted that the threat to his life, and implicitly to mine, from Sterling was real and final. That's why he didn't fight the cancer that took his heart. He simply accepted his sentence. But his final message revealed his great act of self-defense. To Helen, my gentle bookkeeper, you deserve a better ending than this mess of war and betrayal. They were looking for the millions here, hidden under my nose. I made sure there were none. Weeks before the final assessment, I emptied every joint account, our savings, all my bond investments, everything, and moved every cent, all of it. I legally restructured and donated the entire, absolute whole of our life savings, well over $3 million, to the South Georgia Community Library Foundation. I knew your name on my co-trustee account would grant you immediate, protected administrative control over the endowment. I gasped, a sudden, sharp, unexpected sound in the damp silence. My husband, the man who let me believe he had abandoned me to petty financial worries, had in one massive, unilateral humanitarian act given the full force of his personal life into the one institution he knew I loved and would protect, the library. The money wasn't a military slush fund. It was the foundation of my professional existence, laundered into clean funds forever beyond the reach of greedy children and IRS agents looking for criminal conspiracy.
His legacy wasn't the unreadable log. His legacy was the absolute perfect peace he bought me at the ultimate personal expense. The sheer volume of the sound from the kitchen suddenly hit me. The screaming and the furious, pointless destruction above me was now noise. David and Sarah could tear every linoleum tile, splinter every joist. They would find nothing but dirt and ancient, honest mistakes. The colossal collapse they were seeking was only reserved for themselves upon their discovery of their magnificent, self-inflicted zero. My duty was immediately and utterly clear. Use the Aegis blackmail, the Sterling documents, to destroy the political threat, ensure the library's absolute safety, and then completely eliminate my children's right to speak out against me, forever insulating my new, sovereign life. The librarian was ready for her final, devastating counterplay. The hammering above me stopped instantly. A dead silence fell over the house, more terrifying than their greedy rampage. They had hit solid foundation. David and Sarah's realization that they were physically and financially defeated, all for nothing, was about to erupt. I moved quickly, ascending the basement stairs, clutching the log that proved their colossal, self-inflicted mistake. I found them in the devastated kitchen. The site was total chaos. Shattered linoleum, splintered joists, dusty sweat streaking their manicured faces. The fury in David's eyes upon seeing me was animalistic, raw, and focused. He lunged immediately, screaming about a police call and the log. "The gold, where is it, Mom? You set us up. We are calling the local sheriff right now for the removal of stolen assets." "Get back, David," I commanded.
My voice, low and level, held an unshakable authority they had never heard from the quiet librarian. I was the personification of Bob's calm military strength, now wearing the mask of my own survival. I pushed the journal, not at David, but at Sarah, the cold pragmatist forcing her lawyer's brain to process reality. You want a police investigation, Sarah. You want an audit of your life and your assets? Look closely. Your father didn't hide gold. He created a log of retaliation. I flipped the journal open, pointing not to the codes, but to the final hidden love note. Bob's confession about the library endowment, the legacy of zero. Sarah's lawyer brain short-circuited completely. She processed the magnitude instantly. Millions gone, forever. Their ruthless rampage was officially over, defeated by a single act of perfect financial concealment that used the very system they were now attacking to ensure their failure. David only understood the zero. He let out a profound, ruined yell of utter betrayal and despair that echoed off the high ceiling. Their entire life plan, founded on seizing this non-existent gold, was obliterated. They collapsed on the remaining intact floorboards, utterly broken. The real threat, the one that required a true defense, was about to arrive. My dramatic phone call and their domestic destruction were not quiet enough for the suburb. The senator's agents were due to appear. I secured my ultimate, unassailable defense: political exposure. Using Bob's decoded log, the precise operational details that compromised Senator Sterling, I calmly executed the next stage. I had Frank prepare for the total broadcast. My instruction was precise. Bob's shortwave radio in Carolina was to be tuned not to a communication line, but to the emergency override frequency of a specific major Washington, D.C. news station, the most reputable journalistic institution I had found in my genealogical research. Using the burner phone I secured earlier, I sent one simple text message, complete with the photograph of the most damaging entry in the log, the Aegis assets linked to covert action, directly to the senator's personal emergency aids phone, a contact number I located on a forgotten expense form. The message was not a request, it was a verdict. Log data transfer complete. Begins public broadcast in T-minus 30 minutes via name of DC News Channel. My strategy was pure checkmate. I offered the senator the worst-case scenario, public destruction and indictment, to guarantee my ultimate safe exit. Within 30 minutes, the response arrived. Not an arrest, not an attack, but a phone call. It was handled by the senator's chief legal counsel, their voice sharp, professional, and radiating the fear of a massive political catastrophe. They demanded immediate verification of the full log in exchange for absolute amnesty and financial compensation for the family. My family, the people who were currently weeping ruins in the kitchen. Mrs. Moore, we are not interested in military fiction. We need assurance that this specific data, the Project Aegis connection, is secured and silenced forever. Name your price. I delivered my own last will and testament in calm, concise sentences. My price is twofold. First, total, irrevocable, and guaranteed immunity from all current and future political, legal, and criminal action for myself, my deceased husband, and for my children, David and Sarah. Their emotional state is fragile, and any action against them for their financial rampage ends now. This shielded them from the police I myself had misled. Second, my voice did not falter. The librarian had finally seized total control. I required the complete legal liquidation of Senator Sterling's personal investment in the Washington Foundation. The liquidated funds, including the full valuation of the entire political holding, are to be immediately and quietly transferred as an endowment to the South Georgia Community Library Foundation. This entire transaction must be completed before the sun sets. I didn't ask for millions for myself. I asked for the one thing I needed most, unassailable safety, and the funding of the one place that made my quiet life safe. I weaponized the political machine's biggest fear, scandal, to pay for my freedom and Bob's truest legacy, the library endowment. The liquidation and transfer took hours of brutal negotiation, but the fear of the political firestorm I controlled was greater than any resistance. By nightfall, the transfer was done. The South Georgia Community Library Foundation became instantly one of the best funded in the entire region, thanks to a politically motivated, criminal cash transfer it never asked for. I gave the senator's agent one final act of obedience. I presented them with a document, an anonymous typed log summary detailing only Bob's surveillance code and Frank's shortwave location. My promise was a devastating taunt. They could find Frank and stop the future broadcast only by immediately pursuing the asset I sold them out. They had to sacrifice their colleague to silence the truth, proving that Bob's code was current and lethal. I had given them only enough rope to hang the other ghosts, securing my own clean exit. The real journal, Bob's original, heavy, truthful log, remains with me, a priceless physical archive. The library became the place where my safety was assured, my legacy solidified by the corrupt elite themselves. David and Sarah were completely defeated, unable to press charges because the stolen fortune never existed, and they now faced political enemies whose power dwarfed their legal arrogance. They retreated, humiliated, their wealth reduced to zero. They couldn't accuse me. That would invite the wrong kind of investigation onto their own small frauds. I finally liquidated the final assets of my home, the one thing they couldn't take, and bought a small, discreet home near the Foundation Library, my final, well-funded refugee. I accepted my role, the silent trustee and archivist of an immense political sin, my comfortable future paid for by the political crime I helped expose. The woman who never sought credit or power now held both. I am Helen Moore. The law confirmed that some of the deepest political corruption can only be bought off with millions, and some truths can only be preserved by silence. I walked out of that toxic life not rich in silver, but rich in a profound and total liberation, funded by the exact corruption my honest husband taught me to audit. The law confirmed that Bob wasn't a traitor, but the last hero of his own lost, quiet life. My library card now grants me absolute sovereign peace.